Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to August 2021 Lunch and Learn. It is really hard for me to fathom this, but this is our 96th Lunch and Learn lecture. We will finish out this year at 100 in December. I got a little bit of announcements and updates to bring you before we get to our speaker. First, on September 17th, our next Lunch and Learn speaker will be our friend Mary Beth Fitz with the Office of State Archaeology in North Carolina. She'll be talking about the archaeology of Cheraw Town in the Catawba Nation, right here close to our Lancaster campus. Today, we have our first annual W. Brent Bergen lecture. Family, friends, and colleagues of Brent's raised money. Many of you on this lecture today were involved in that, and we endowed a lecture. And the idea is that we'll be able to have an annual lecture dedicated in honor of our archivist and colleague and friend, Brent Bergen. Brent Bergen, for those of you who don't know, is heroically meeting the challenge of ALS. And unfortunately, he's at the doctor today. The ALS clinic schedules his appointments without any input from Brent. And so he sends his regards. And when I asked him yesterday, how he felt about this, he said he was just really pleased with this and very peacefully. He said, "I'm kind of glad I'm not there because I might get emotional." He'll be retiring on August 31st and working with us part-time as we move into the next archivist for the Native American Studies Center. As archaeologists, we're always trying to invent time machines and go back in the past. And Brent has been able to do that from the archives. And you saw a picture earlier of him showing photographs to some of the Catawba citizens, pictures they'd never seen of some of their departed family members. And about 2 weeks ago, Brent shared an audio recording with one of the tribal council members of the Eddystone. And I'm guessing she's in her 40s or early 50s. And she wrote back, "This is just so amazing. I haven't heard my father's voice since I was 10 years old." And so in the archives, there are time machines. Brent said something to the effect of when Starr Hall was dedicated, Mr. Starr said that he was pleased that one day that, and forever onward, there'd be a building in his name. And I recall Lou Gehrig, the famous Yankee player, upon his retirement. And his quote is, "Today I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth." And that's how Brent feels about this lecture. And so my hat's off to Brent Bergen. Today, we're very fortunate to have Bill Ramsey from Lander University as our first annual Brent Bergen lecturer. Bill received his PhD in history from Tulane. His book, The Yamasee War, A Study of Culture, Economy, and Conflict in the Colonial South, is really a must read for anyone who wants to understand the complexities of the Yamasee War. He's published in the Journal of American History, the South Carolina Historical Magazine, the Georgia Historical Quarterly. And one that I'm kind of curious about is an article he said, "You say Yamasee and I say Yamasee." And a lot of times the native folks say Yamasee and the historians say Yamasee. So maybe Bill can inform us about that. And then I also have to thank Ashley Larimore and Katie Scholl behind the scenes, making everything work really smoothly here at Lunch and Learn. So with that said, welcome everybody, and I'll turn the floor over to Bill Ramsey, and he can share his screen and give us his lecture today, which is the artificial heads and the market, how the traditional approaches to hunting affected the origins of the Yamasee War. The floor is yours, Bill.
Thank you, Chris. Hopefully I can navigate all of this. I need to share my screen first, I guess. Here we go. Is that coming up? Are we okay? Can you see my screen?
It has not come up yet, Bill. Click that green arrow, and then you have to open your PowerPoint.
Yeah, that darn green arrow is the one that trips me up every time. How about now?
There you go. Yeah, go ahead to your from current slide and you're good to go.
Okay, let's see. Okay, are we good? Okay, thank you, Chris, and hello to everybody. I see many names I'm familiar with, and I wish we could just have a chat rather than listening to old Bill Ramsey, but I'll continue for a bit. I apologize for my appearance. I considered getting a haircut for you guys, but we began teaching on Monday, and I thought it might be fun for the students to see a historian in his feral state. So I'm still a little bit natural today. My topic is the market, one of my preoccupations from earlier scholarship, artificial heads and the market. And we'll talk about artificial heads in just a minute. How traditional approaches to hunting affected the origins of the Yamasee War. And I still do pronounce it as I first encountered it in graduate school, Yamasee. It's a mere habit. It's hard to say exactly how they themselves pronounced it. My focus today is on a reconsideration of one of my earlier arguments. There is a cover image of my book about the Yamasee War, cleverly titled The Yamasee War. I put forward an argument, a multifaceted argument, in which market influence was one aspect of the origins of the war. Cultural differences, I argued, gender-specific violence and other types of cultural manifestations had an impact and influence on the coming of the war as well. But I put forward an argument that wove into some of those elements, market influence, the idea that participation and commercial exchange created tension. It wasn't the decisive or sole element in the coming of the Yamasee War, but I argue that it was a stressor, that it created frustration, that demanded adept diplomacy on the part of both Indian nations and South Carolina to maintain peace. And ultimately that diplomacy broke down in 1715. But I was interested as I pursued it in trying to find Native American voices from that early time period. The Yamasee War, for those of you not familiar with it, broke out in April of 1715. So I'm looking at some of the earlier developments that may have led to frustration and that exchange relationship. But I was interested in finding Native American voices and what American Indians actually said they were upset about. And the Journals of the Indian Commissioners was one of my primary sources for that. And I found a number of complaints, one being complaints about prices and the need to haggle over merchandise. Carolina traders didn't think twice about it, about selling scarce items for more amount of money. The law of supply and demand was very familiar to them, but it was sometimes annoying, worse for a warrior to make a purchase of gunpowder or flints or a musket at one price and go home and find that his neighbor, his fellow warrior, had purchased it for much less from the same trader in a previous season or perhaps only weeks earlier. So there was some frustration based on the new idea of commercial exchange with South Carolinians, relatively new. There had been exchange with the Spanish in Florida previously, but one of the major sources of disruption I found was a structural reconfiguration of the trade, which took place between about 1704, maybe beginning in 1703 to 1706, a very rapid restructuring or transformation of the exchange relationship, things purchased, things brought to market during that period. Prior to that transformation, the Carolina trade brought in a relatively diverse range of peltries that probably represented what Native Americans were pursuing prior to the advent of the Carolina trade. I'm not sure I can name them all offhand. I'll do my best, but export tallies from Carolina and what little records I could find of actual exchanges in the backcountry involved a broad variety of products. Deerskins, of course, are the recognizable staple of the 18th century, but there were exchanges of significant volumes of bear skins, raccoon skins, fox skins, mountain lions or panthers, beaver pelts, and a variety of others that are escaping my mind at the moment. But a real fur trade, not a deerskin trade as is typically referred to in the 18th century, but a genuine fur trade of a broad variety. That collapsed, not slowly, it wasn't phased out, but it disappeared relatively rapidly from the export tallies, the export totals submitted by Carolina. And from that point forward, about 1706 to 1707, from that point forward, it's fair to talk about a deerskin trade. The white-tailed deer became the overwhelmingly significant staple, the predominant staple. You can still find a few other peltries in the cargoes going back to Great Britain, but for instance, for a 3-year period, I think 1713 to 1715, alongside the tens of thousands of deer skins, there were seven raccoon skins sent back to Great Britain. So the collapse of those other peltries was distinct. And even though one or two, a few, 7 might have crossed the Atlantic, it was not a significant presence after that transformation. And so in my book and my Journal of American History article, I wanted to think about the causes. And that's kind of my focus for criticizing myself today. Initially, I focused on the demands of the Atlantic economy, what the Carolina traders were interested in purchasing, what they thought they could get a profit for. And the prices I came across seemed to support that interpretation. And in my own defense, I'll say I was partially right about some of that, but I now realize that there were deeper currents at work. For the beaver skins, the prices had deteriorated in the late 1690s, early 1700s as a result of a variety of things. Most importantly, perhaps the glut of beaver skins on the market from the Canadian fur trade, but also changing fashions. The old beaver skin hats, the guard hairs of the beaver's fur were worked by the hatters in London using mercury as one of their key ingredients into a felt that could create a waterproof hat. But those beaver felt hats had begun to drop out of fashion, fall out of fashion by the first decade of the 1700s. And increasingly, the Carolina hat, a leather, broad-brimmed hat, was the style. So there were market elements depressing the demand for beaver as well. But in 2019, I had the good fortune to travel to the British National Archives again, this time thanks to the generosity of my home institution. Lander University had faith in my scholarly promise, old as I appeared, and sent me across the waters. And here I am crossing the Thames there. That's not the National Archives in the background. I wandered a bit away from my usual routine this day. That's Henry VIII's Hampton Court Palace in the background. But I spent a few weeks at the National Archives, and my main purpose was to build a research foundation for my next book, which moves forward from the Yamasee War and traces some of my ideas through the 1720s and 1730s, and even farther afield than that. But as I was going through the National Archives, I found things that intrigued me and called me off in different directions. And being the inquisitive person that I am, I wandered away following some of those leads. One of them had to do with a ship that had set sail from Carolina. There was a record collection of appraisals made in the Admiralty courts of plunder taken by pirates that had been recaptured either by the British Navy or English pirates. And some of those ships came from Carolina during the time period I was interested in. One of them, the Ruby, I'll try to limit myself. It's an exciting story. And of course, I want to be as entertaining as possible. But the Ruby was built in Carolina and set sail with a full cargo in 1702. Went up to Virginia and tried to meet up with a convoy. This was the early phase, the first year of Queen Anne's War. So British ships were trying to sail together for protection. And it didn't work for the Ruby. It made it across the Atlantic with its convoy, but then it ran into a French privateer in the English Channel, was given chase for about a day and finally boarded and captured by those French pirates. And then English pirates showed up before they could get back to the, before the French pirates could get back to the French coast, and chased the ship down and captured it for their purposes. I believe they put the French pirates to the sword, and the small handful of English crewmen, some of them in their early teens, made it clear they were English speakers. They were not part of the French pirate crew. They told the story to the English pirates who were operating out of the British Channel island of Guernsey. And in a remarkable display of responsibility for pirates, the Guernsey pirates, recognizing that it was an English ship, turned it over to the British Admiralty courts for adjudication to figure out who was the owner and how they should be compensated. So what we have with the documents of the Ruby is a unique time capsule of the trade and one ship's cargo. It was all still present on board the ship. So it was loaded in 1702 before this transformation that I proposed in my first book, and finally inventoried. There, by the way, you have Captain Jack Sparrow from the Disney franchise, and he, I believe, is wearing something close to what might be called a Carolina hat. Captain Jack Sparrow in that picture has it pinned up as a tricorn, but were he to let it down, it would be very similar to a Carolina hat. And in the early 1700s, it would likely, more often than not, have been made of Carolina deerskins. But it was finally inventoried in 1704, and it gives us a complete picture of what was being shipped back from Carolina during that period, and confirms that in 1702, Carolina was still buying from and shipping back to England a broad range of peltries, and it gives the appraiser's evaluation of all of those products. Here is an image from the appraisal of the Ruby. It's a many-page document, and I don't think anyone had ever, or at least it had been a long time, those pages did not want to unfold. They had been triple folded and tied with twine, and they did not want to let go of each other. So I'm holding it down there at the bottom. Some of these prices support my early idea that the demands of the market, let me activate my laser pointer, that the demands of the market were at play. You have the first column here, pounds, then shillings and pence. At the top there, the raccoon skins were just not very valuable. They were appraised in 1704 at less than a shilling per skin. That's 188 raccoon skins. So they were still being hunted and exchanged in the Carolina frontier, but in London, they were not highly desired. They were not sought after. So 2 pounds was all they were estimated at. 188 raccoon skins valued at merely 2 pounds. So that was a price that I think likely would have phased out raccoons anyway, based on the so-called invisible hand of the marketplace. But right under that, you have trouble. For William Ramsay's original idea that prices were the driving mechanism here, those are bear skins. Only 46. Far fewer than the raccoon skins, but they're valued at 10 pounds, 17 shillings. That's 4 shillings per bear skin, I believe, 4 pence. But that's significantly more than deer skins. The appraisers valued deer skins, and perhaps there was some element of foliage or rot that had devalued the deer skins, but they were valued on this cargo at less than 2 shillings, I believe. So the bear skins were selling. The bear skins were desired. They brought a good price in London, and just on the surface of it, that does not explain why bear skins disappeared from the Carolina Indian trade. So I began to wonder whether or not there might have been other issues at play. I apologize for the flippancy of this next image. I began to question whether perhaps there were some supply side issues rather than simply the demand in Europe for those products, whether the suppliers, the hunters, methods of hunting and so forth might have played some role in this transformation of the trade. So I began reading a little more deeply into the matter as you see this fine actor and his human co-star doing in the early 1950s. This is a backstage photo, of course, of the making of Bedtime for Bonzo. I was already a young adult in the early Reagan era, so I ought to be desensitized to this, but I had some real issues typing supply side up there, and just between 45 or so of us here, I may well need to go and seek counseling or therapy after the presentation. But I began to see a few patterns in the terms of the methods of hunting deer. That's the staple that, of course, emerged as the winner and the exchange relationship. There were a number of approaches. Individual stalking, that's where the artificial heads come in. This, I think, is a DeBry painting of Native American hunters using artificial heads to entice male deer, to challenge them and get them close enough to kill them. Individual stalking during the rutting season primarily. I have a quick quote, if I can find it, from John Lawson. He observed this technique among the Santee Nation of the Low Country of South Carolina. According to John Lawson, about a year before the Ruby set sail, this was written, the hunter puts on a match coat made of deer skin with the hair on, and a piece of the white part of the deer skin that grows on the breast, which is fastened to the neck end of this stalking head, so hangs down. In these habiliments, an Indian will go as near a deer as he pleases, the exact motions and behavior of a deer being so well counterfeited by them that several times it hath been known for 2 hunters to come with a stalking head together and unknown to each other, so that they have killed an Indian instead of a deer, which hath happened sometimes to be a brother or some dear friend. This method almost certainly was most effective during the rutting season, September to December every year, during which male deer seeking to reproduce became wildly reckless. And it created a unique archaeological signature. Perhaps some of the archaeologists listening in can correct me if I'm mistaken. I'd rather be shamed publicly here than publish something and endure permanent shame. But it left a unique archaeological signature. This method of hunting tended to leave behind bones of mature male deer, so it can be recognized in the archaeological record. Overwhelmingly middle-aged and mature male deer with very few youngsters, very few elderly deer, and very few other female deer. Another very popular method of hunting was fire hunting, communal methods of hunting. You see in the background, unfortunately, I couldn't find one for Carolina, but this is a New England picture from the 1630s of a fire hunt, which could be pursued either by driving the herd towards a narrow impasse or impediment and killing them there, or by setting a circular fire. Thomas Nairn observed one of those hunts in 1708. The hunters post themselves within, as nigh the smoke and flame as they can endure. The fire on each side burns in toward the center, and thither the deer gather from all part to avoid it, but striving to shun a death which they might often escape by a violent spring, they fall into a certain one from the bullets of the hunters, who, drawing nigher together as the circle grows less, find an easy prey of the impounded deer. And a number of other animals typically fell into that trap as well, but increasingly the deer were the targets, the chosen targets. And this method of hunting, and this ties into the argument a little farther down the road, this method of hunting also left a unique signature. The bones of the deer left in towns that were predominantly using this type of communal hunting tactic tended to represent the natural range of genders and ages within a deer population, as stands to reason. As the entire population closed in and were harvested by the hunters, they didn't take just the male deer as they did with the artificial heads. In these harvests, the age range ran the gamut of a natural population and the genders as well. So archaeologists can see which towns were pursuing this tactic. Gregory Wasilkoff observed an evolution, a trend between these two methods of hunting. And he wrote what I think is an undervalued article in the 1970s, The Evolution of Deer Hunting in the Eastern Woodlands, in which he argued that there appeared to be a trend away from individual stalking techniques during the historic era when commercial hunting was becoming increasingly prominent toward communal hunting approaches. He didn't give a specific timeline for it, but he argued that towns that were associated with the historic era tended to have predominantly evidence of communal hunting. And he speculated that the reason was likely to amplify the yield. And I think he's almost certainly right about that. Ecological factors played a part. There's the September to December hunting focus for the white-tailed deer. The white-tailed deer were susceptible to yielding large harvests by those communal hunts, and they had a reproductive rate, at least in the early 18th century. There has been speculation of a deer shortage, but the export totals suggest that there were quite a few to be harvested well into the 1740s and 1750s. They had a high enough rate of reproduction to sustain early 18th century communal hunting, at least for a limited time. In the historical context, there was chronic conflict between Indian nations in the historic period. The Indian slave trade was destabilizing the entire region. Nations went to war with nations. The Spanish mission system was one of the primary targets for those slave raids. But Alan Galley, in his Bancroft Prize-winning book, The Indian Slave Trade, estimated that at the height of the Indian slave trade prior to the Yamasee War, perhaps as many as 50,000 Native Americans were captured and exported as slaves to other European colonies. And the highlight of that era of chronic conflict and instability was Governor James Moore of South Carolina's raid on the Spanish missions of northern Florida, the Appalachee raids of 1702 and 1704 that brought back to Carolina tens of thousands of captured mission Indians, some for forcible relocation and many others likely for export. But I would add that that historical context suggests that communal hunting might also have been desirable during this period as a way of protecting the hunters in a very dangerous landscape. The stalking heads, the artificial heads, individual hunting techniques would have put hunters into really dangerous situations when they came up against hunting parties from other nations. So I came up with a criteria for market era viability, things that would have made a staple worthwhile. Susceptibility to communal hunting in order to provide defense for hunters. And for the deer, that one gets a yes. Susceptibility to communal hunting to amplify the yield. And the white-tailed deer worked on that score as well. High enough reproductive rate to make the harvest sustainable year after year, at least for a few decades. And the deer were a yes on that as well. And finally, the one that I relied on primarily in my book, market value. And there the deer were not the most valuable staple, but they were valuable enough to make them worthwhile. So the deer check off all of those criteria. The black bear, subjected to that same approach, had a different outcome. The hunting season typically for a black bear in the Southeast was January. The deer trade prior to the advent of the market would wind down towards the end of December, and hunters would begin to focus on bears in January. That's the beginning of the hibernation season. They wanted to catch them at the beginning of the sleep in January rather than at the end of the sleep in March, because at the end they would be all scrawny and not nearly as worthwhile as they were when they were fattened and ready for the hibernation. And the hunting method here was quite different from the white-tailed deer. The hunting parties would scour the woods looking for places where the black bear may have holed up for the winter, and that could be a variety of locations. The roots of trees that had fallen over, caves, or as in this image, hollowed out knots of trees. Wherever they saw a hollow in a tree like this, the warriors, the hunters would investigate. They would look at the bark of the tree to see if there were any claw marks from the bears going up into that hole. And if so, they would send someone up. I wouldn't want to be that hunter, but they would send someone up. And ideally, they would search for a smaller tree close by that would allow them to look down into the hole, but sometimes directly up the tree to see if there was a bear up there. And if so, there you have the process there, the sleuthing, the detective work to find the bear, then the poking of the bear. I wouldn't want that job either, to wake it up. And as it emerged from the hole, someone to shoot the poor bear. So at a bare minimum, 2 hunters to get that job done, perhaps 4 to 5 maximum. The black bear, however, had a relatively low reproductive rate. It produced between 1 and 4 cubs per mating season, sometimes only 1 or 2, and sometimes the mothers produced for a couple of years on a row no offspring at all. So the black bear was never a real option for sustainable harvest at high commercial levels. Here are those criteria again. Was it susceptible to communal hunting methods to provide defense for the hunters? Well, I guess 100 hunters could have gathered around that tree to protect themselves from the Indian slave trade, but in the end, only 1 could climb up the tree, and only 1 was really required to shoot the bear when it came out. So there's a no to that. Second, susceptible to communal hunting to amplify the yield. Even if you were to mobilize 100 warriors around that tree, at the end of the day, there would only be one bear, one bear killed. So communal hunting absolutely struck out in terms of amplifying the yield on the black bear. It had a very low reproductive rate. And one, yes, it did have a very respectable market value. So even though based on the price markers that I was originally looking at, it looks like it should be an attractive commodity, it was not viable in these other criteria. And lastly, the beaver. That is, believe it or not, the cutest picture of a beaver I was able to find on the internet. And needless to say, one has to be very careful about searching for such images, search terms entered. But the beaver was an entirely different story. It created its own aquatic habitat, and that was easy enough to find. The beaver dams and the beaver ponds were easily identifiable, and hunters could go to those ponds to hunt the beaver. But there the story became a bit more complex. Beavers were very clever. They had a very good sense of when they were being observed and stalked. And any hunter seeking to bring in a beaver pelt had to spend a significant amount of time simply observing, having found the pond, simply observing the routines and different projects that the beaver was engaged in. So that could be multiple days downwind, observing the movements of the beaver, where it was working to identify where a trap might be placed so that it would seem not too conspicuous, not too threatening. A trap loaded with mulberry bark, one of the beaver's favorite snacks. And ultimately trapping the beaver. I put shooting up here because there are occasional mentions of that. I don't know of any hunters who were successful in laying out there in the woods and actually getting a clean shot of a beaver. So trapping was the overwhelming method, and usually a lone trapper. The reproductive rate of the beaver was slightly higher than that of the black bear, but still only about 1 to 4 kits, 1 to 5 kits in a nuclear family per year. So it was not an ideal candidate for sustainable harvest either. Here are those criteria. The communal hunting to provide defense had the same context, same issue as the bear hunting. Yes, you could send 100 hunters to surround that beaver pond, and they would be well defended against the Indian slave trade, but they would never see that beaver again. If somehow surrounding the beaver pond with 100 or more hunters managed to capture a beaver, at the end of the day, again, you had only the one beaver as the harvest. So communal hunting was not a real option for the beaver trade. The reproductive rate was not ideal, and here the beavers struck out uniformly. The price of the beavers in the first decade of the beaver pelts in the first decade of the 1700s were not attractive. And there were complaints about that in New York and Canada as well. This was not limited just to the Southeast. The Canadian fur traders were very concerned about the fact that they were not able to turn those pelts around for a profit, and yet they felt like they still needed to be purchasing them for friendship and alliance purposes with their Native American trade partners in the interior. So what I came away with was a sense that there are far deeper currents at work in this transformation. I'm still very proud of myself for identifying that structural transformation of the trade between 1702 to 1706, but I now realize there are some deeper trends at work, and I very much like the opportunities for additional research that it opens up, because not only is the process being driven, not only was the process being driven, I think, by European demand by the prices offered for some of those products, but the nature of the animals themselves, the techniques used by Native American hunters, all of it played into this transformation. And the result was what I think must have been a very wrenching change. Some historians argue that that commercial exchange, that deerskin trade didn't require very much accommodation on the part of Native American hunters because they were still doing things they had done before. I would say no, they were not. By 1706, 1707, certainly by the time of the Yamasee War, they were not doing exactly what they had been doing prior to the coming of the Carolina colony. They were focusing increasingly on the deerskin trade. The deerskin season was beginning to overlap and overrun the bearskin hunting season, and created, I'm sure, a series of ripple effects and linkages that destabilized and created change within Native American societies that we're just beginning to think about and think about exploring. So that's what I have for you guys today. And I'm not sure what I need to do now to minimize my screen and talk to people, but I would be very interested to hear criticism and questions and share thoughts.